The bank manager ripped the $2 million check in half and smirked, certain the mud on Isaiah Freeman's boots was proof enough that a black farmer could never own that kind of money. No verification, no questions. Just prejudice dressed in a suit and called bank policy. Then he accused Isaiah of fraud, summoned the police, and prepared to watch an innocent man leave in handcuffs. But the moment the bank's regional president entered, his face went pale. He rushed toward the farmer and said one word that froze the entire lobby. "Sir, where are you watching from? Stay until the end, this reckoning will not disappoint you." At 1012 on a bright Tuesday morning, the main branch of Aldercrest Bank and Trust in Jackson, Mississippi, looked less like a neighborhood bank and more like a private club for the wealthy. Employees hurried between polished mahogany desks, adjusting folders and straightening their jackets before the arrival of a major investment group. Men in tailored suits checked their watches beneath crystal lights, while well-dressed clients spoke quietly near the marble counters. Then Isaiah Freeman walked through the revolving doors, wearing an old straw hat, a faded work shirt, worn jeans, and heavy boots still stained with red Mississippi soil. Several people glanced at him and quickly looked away. Isaiah noticed, but he did not react. At 69, he had learned that some people revealed everything about themselves before saying a single word. He approached the counter carrying a waterproof envelope and waited until Maya Reynolds, a young banking specialist, called him forward. Isaiah placed the envelope carefully on the desk and removed a cashier's check for $2 million. He asked her to deposit it into the Freeman Ridgeland Trust account and explained that the funds had to be verified before 3 o'clock the following afternoon. Maya examined his identification, the authorization documents, and the check itself. She passed it through a security scanner, checked the routing numbers, and inspected the embedded ink. Every security feature appeared genuine. Her screen showed only one remaining step: final confirmation from the issuing institution. From behind the glass wall of his office, branch manager Grant Whitlock saw the amount on Maya's monitor before he saw Isaiah's name. He stood immediately and crossed the lobby with the confidence of a man who believed the entire building belonged to him. Without greeting, Isaiah Grant reached across the counter and lifted the check from Maya's hand. His eyes moved from the $2 million figure to Isaiah's muddy boots, then back again. "A man who walks in here with dirt on his shoes doesn't just happen to own $2 million, he said loudly enough for nearby clients to hear. Conversation stopped. Isaiah's expression remained calm. He told Grant to contact the issuing bank and complete the verification. Instead, Grant demanded to know whose check Isaiah had stolen. Maya quietly explained that the security marks were valid and that the confirmation request was already processing. Grant snapped at her to stop interfering. He accused Isaiah of attempting financial fraud and declared the check counterfeit before the system had returned its final response. Then, with a cold smile, he gripped the paper in both hands and tore it down the middle. The sound was small, but in the silent lobby it landed like a gunshot. As he separated the pieces, Grant used his thumb to tear away a narrow strip containing the final digits of the verification code. He folded it beneath his palm and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Isaiah looked at the torn paper on the counter, then bent down and collected the pieces that had fallen to the floor. He did not shout, threaten, or move toward Grant. "You just destroyed a financial instrument you never verified," he said. Grant replied that he was protecting the bank from a criminal. He ordered Security Chief Darius King to lock the entrance and call the police. Darius hesitated, but Grant repeated the command in front of everyone. Within minutes, 2 officers entered the lobby. Grant rushed toward them and described Isaiah as aggressive, unstable, and connected to an organized fraud operation. Isaiah remained beside the counter with both hands visible, understanding exactly how dangerous one misunderstood movement could become. When a customer raised a phone to record, Grant told an employee to block the camera and ordered everyone to stop filming. One officer stepped behind Isaiah and reached for his handcuffs. At that exact moment, the private elevator opened. Nathaniel Crow, Aldercrest's regional president, entered with 3 assistants. He looked toward the police, then at Isaiah, and finally at the check torn across the counter. The color drained from his face. He crossed the lobby, quickly ignoring Grant completely. "Sir Nathaniel," said his voice suddenly careful and respectful, "please tell me no one touched your check." The entire bank fell silent. Grant stood frozen with one torn half still in his hand. Near the security station, Darius glanced down at the message Grant had sent to police dispatch. It did not say suspected counterfeit check. It read, subject linked to organized financial fraud, may resist arrest. Grant had not merely doubted Isaiah. He had prepared a reason to have him arrested before the truth could be verified. Nathaniel ordered everyone into a private conference room to correct the mistake, but Isaiah could already see the fear behind his polite expression. The man who had called him sir had not arrived to protect him. He had arrived to control what Isaiah would be allowed to say next. The executive conference room on the 18th floor of Aldercrest Bank felt less like a place for resolving mistakes and more like a chamber designed to bury them. The door clicked shut behind Isaiah Freeman. The glass walls were covered by dark blinds, and every employee was ordered to place a phone on the polished table. Grant Whitlock sat stiffly near the end, his face pale but still defensive. Maya Reynolds stood beside the wall, while Darius King remained near the door, watching everyone more carefully than before. Nathaniel Crowe took the head chair and began by condemning Grant's behavior, though his language was strangely careful. He called the destruction of the check an unfortunate error in risk assessment, not the deliberate destruction of a financial instrument, not racial profiling, and certainly not an attempt to have an innocent man arrested. Grant lowered his head but insisted he had only followed his duty to protect the bank. Nathaniel then explained why he had addressed Isaiah with respect. Isaiah was not merely a farmer. He had founded the Freeman Ridge Cooperative, whose funds kept tens of millions of dollars deposited at Aldercrest. 16 years earlier, during a liquidity crisis, Isaiah had persuaded local farmers not to withdraw their savings, preventing the bank's agricultural division from collapsing. He also held voting authority over a block of legacy shares placed in trust decades ago. Grant finally understood that he had humiliated a man whose influence reached far beyond the dirt on his boots. Isaiah listened without pride. None of those facts changed what Grant had done when he believed Isaiah had no power. Before Nathaniel could continue, the door opened and Simone Freeman entered, carrying a leather folder. Isaiah had called his granddaughter from the lobby, and she had arrived, not as a frightened relative, but as an attorney, prepared for a fight. She introduced herself, sat beside Isaiah, and immediately demanded that Aldercrest preserve all surveillance footage, account access logs, police communications, internal messages, and every remaining fragment of the check. She also demanded the name of the person who described Isaiah as part of an organized fraud ring and written confirmation that the check had never been officially identified as counterfeit. Nathaniel avoided every request. He claimed the bank needed time to review internal policy, then offered what he called a reasonable solution. Aldercrest would arrange a replacement check, process the deposit within several business days, and pay Isaiah $100,000 for the inconvenience. In return, Isaiah would sign a statement describing the incident as a misunderstanding and agree not to contact the media regulators or law enforcement. Isaiah pushed the agreement back without touching the pen. "Several days is too late," he said. The $2 million had to be verified before 3 o'clock the following afternoon. That deposit would activate the Freeman Ridge Land Trust's right to redeem 23 family farms from default. If the deadline passed by even 1 minute, the purchase rights would transfer automatically to Terravex Agricultural Holdings. Nathaniel's expression changed. The apology disappeared from his voice. He began talking about anti-fraud procedures, federal reviews, and delays that could last 30 days. Simone watched him closely. Isaiah had not explained the redemption deadline before entering the room, yet Nathaniel spoke as though he already knew exactly what was at stake. Maya quietly gathered the torn pieces of the check and arranged them on the table. She studied the edges, then looked up. A narrow strip containing the final 4 digits of the verification code was missing. Grant claimed it must have fallen in the lobby, but Darius remembered seeing him slip one hand into his jacket immediately after tearing the paper. Simone asked when the fraud case had been opened. Nathaniel refused to answer. An internal attorney, attempting to defend the bank, accidentally mentioned the incident file number and said it had been created at 9:25 that morning. Silence followed. Isaiah had entered the bank nearly an hour later. Simone leaned forward. "You opened a fraud investigation before my grandfather arrived." Nathaniel ended the meeting at once. He suspended Maya's system access and ordered security to escort Isaiah and Simone from the building. As they reached the elevator, Maya brushed past Simone and slipped a business card into her hand. Written on the back was a system entry 941 AM, validated, no fraud indicators. Grant had known the check was real before Isaiah ever walked through the doors. This was no longer the prejudice of one arrogant manager. It was a plan prepared in advance and the clock counting down on 23 farms had already begun. By the time Isaiah Freeman and Simone returned to Freeman Ridge Farm, the sun had already dropped behind the fields, leaving the farmhouse lit by the cold glow of laptops and emergency phone calls. Members of the cooperative crowded around the long wooden table while Simone laid out the true stakes of the destroyed check. The $2 million was not simply a large deposit. It was the final escrow payment required to activate a land conservation program backed by federal guarantees and private foundations. Once confirmed, the payment would release $240 million in refinancing funds, enough to remove 23 family farms from foreclosure and place their acreage inside a protected community land trust. Terravex Agricultural Holdings would no longer be able to purchase the farms, divide the land, or sell it to developers. Isaiah had believed Grant Whitlock had attacked the check because he could not imagine a black farmer possessing that much money. Simone now saw something far more dangerous. Aldercrest was not trying to steal $2 million. Someone inside the bank was trying to prevent the release of $240 million. Before the cooperative could decide how to respond, a notification appeared on Simone's phone. Aldercrest had released a 19-second security video to local news stations and social media. The footage began after Grant had torn the check. It showed Isaiah stepping toward the counter and saying, "You destroyed something that did not belong to you." The bank had amplified. His voice removed the surrounding noise and cut the clip before his calm explanation. It made the sentence sound like a threat. Nothing showed Grant insulting him, refusing verification, stealing part of the code, or ordering police to treat him as dangerous. Within an hour, the clip was spreading under headlines accusing Isaiah of attempting a $2 million fraud. Grant appeared on television in a dark suit, describing himself as a responsible manager who had prevented a serious financial crime. Nathaniel Crowe issued a statement claiming the bank had acted to protect its clients and the community from a suspicious instrument. The damage became immediate. Aldercrest froze every account connected to Freeman Ridge Cooperative. Fuel suppliers refused to release deliveries because payments could not clear. Workers finishing the harvest were told their wages might be delayed. Trucks carrying produce were held at distribution warehouses. Automatic loan payments failed, creating penalties on accounts that had never been late before. Then Terravex sent a formal notice warning that the land redemption agreement could be canceled because the cooperative no longer appeared financially qualified. Isaiah stood in the farmhouse doorway while farmers called one after another asking whether they were about to lose everything. He answered each of them with the same steady promise: no one would face this alone. Across town, Maya Reynolds was suspended for failing to report suspicious customer behavior. Bank attorneys placed a prepared statement in front of her, claiming Isaiah had pressured her to accept the check without verification. Maya refused to sign. She told them the system had marked the check valid and that Grant had seen the result. Her employee access was immediately terminated. That evening, investigative reporter Lena Morales contacted Simone. For 2 years, Lena had received complaints from black farmers whose loans, deposits, and refinancing documents had been delayed on critical dates. Aldercrest always blamed computer errors, incomplete paperwork, or routine compliance reviews. Lena had never been able to prove the delays were intentional. Isaiah's case was the first time the bank had acted too aggressively and left witnesses behind. Simone began preparing an emergency court petition when an alert arrived from a federal financial crimes unit. Aldercrest had reported that someone had attempted to deposit the same $2 million check a second time at another branch. The bank now claimed Isaiah had presented a duplicate instrument, proving the original transaction was fraudulent. Isaiah placed the 2 torn halves on the table. The main check had never left his possession. Only the narrow strip containing the final verification digits was missing, the strip Grant had slipped into his jacket. Simone understood the trap. Grant had used the stolen code to create an image of a second deposit, then connected it to Isaiah's account. In a single evening, the bank had transformed a publicly humiliated customer into the target of a potential federal fraud investigation. Near midnight, headlights swept across the farmhouse windows. Sheriff's vehicles entered the property, carrying a warrant to search Isaiah's office, trucks, computers, and financial records. Simone read the supporting affidavit before allowing the officers inside. Her hands went cold when she reached the final page. The document described the torn check and the exact missing section of the verification code. Yet the affidavit had been signed at 8:50 that morning, more than an hour before Isaiah entered Aldercrest. Someone had written the story of the fake check before he ever arrived, and the next chapter of that story was designed to make him a criminal before the 23 farms could be saved. The search began just after midnight. Sheriff's deputies moved through Freeman Ridge Farm with flashlights, evidence bags, and a warrant broad enough to cover nearly everything Isaiah Freeman owned. They searched the cooperative office, opened filing cabinets, inspected farm trucks, and emptied the contents of a steel safe onto a desk. No counterfeit checks, forged contracts, or hidden financial records were found. Still, the officers seized Isaiah's computer's phones, accounting books, and external drives, claiming each item required further examination. Simone followed them from room to room, documenting every object they removed. When she studied the warrant more closely, she discovered that nearly every accusation came from an internal Aldercrest report signed by Grant Whitlock. Several paragraphs described the missing verification strip and the alleged duplicate deposit, yet parts of the report had clearly been drafted before Isaiah ever entered the bank. The fraud case had not been created in response to his visit. His visit had been arranged to fit a case that already existed. While the search continued, Simone received a message from an unknown number asking her to step outside alone. Darius King waited near an equipment shed, keeping himself beyond the deputy's view. He told her that the security device attached to his uniform had continued recording after Grant tore the check. Darius played a short audio clip. Grant's voice could be heard saying, "Just keep him here until the paperwork is stamped." A second voice came through Grant's earpiece moments later. "The deadline matters more than the customer. Do not let him leave with the instrument intact." The speaker's identity had been hidden because the call passed through Aldercrest's internal communication system, but the message proved that Grant had not acted impulsively. Someone had ordered him to delay Isaiah and make certain the original check could no longer be used. Darius agreed to preserve the recording, but warned Simone that the bank had already begun restricting security access. By morning, Nathaniel Crowe contacted Isaiah and offered to stop the criminal investigation. He requested a private meeting in a luxury hotel conference room far from the bank and its cameras. Nathaniel arrived with Adrian Vale Terravex's chief attorney and placed a thick settlement agreement on the table. Aldercrest would pay Isaiah $500,000, issue a replacement check, remove the 19-second video, withdraw its fraud complaint, and guarantee that Freeman Ridge Farm itself would not be seized. The replacement deposit, however, would not be processed for 5 days, long after the land protection deadline expired. In exchange, Isaiah had to abandon the $240 million conservation program, allow Terravex to acquire the other 22 farms, and sign a permanent non-disclosure agreement. Nathaniel leaned back and spoke as though he were offering mercy. "You can save your own land. No one is asking you to die beside people who failed to save themselves." Isaiah closed the agreement and pushed it across the table. "A farmer who protects his own field while his neighbor's land is taken has not won. He has only been given permission to lose last." While Nathaniel argued, Simone examined the agreement's appendices. One internal reference appeared repeatedly: Project Red Acre. She recognized the name from an old complaint involving delayed loans issued to black farmers. The settlement revealed more than Nathaniel intended. He knew about the deadline, the land trust, and Terravex's planned acquisitions. He had not entered the bank lobby to rescue Isaiah. He had arrived because Grant had turned a quiet financial ambush into a public scandal. Then Simone's phone began ringing. While they were trapped in the meeting, Terravex recovery teams had entered 3 cooperative farms. Tractors, irrigation systems, and harvested crops were being sealed as collateral. At one property, an elderly farmer tried to stop the seizure and was shoved to the ground in front of his wife and grandchildren. Isaiah left the hotel without signing. When he returned to Freeman Ridge, a notice had been nailed to the warehouse door. Property to be sold at public auction 9:00 a.m., 36 hours from now. At the bottom appeared Nathaniel Crowe's electronic signature under the title Creditor Representative. There was no longer time to wait for an ordinary investigation. To save the farms, Isaiah would have to obtain proof from inside Aldercrest before Nathaniel erased the system that contained it. At 12:47 a.m., Maya Reynolds discovered that Aldercrest had scheduled an emergency maintenance procedure for 1 o'clock in the morning. The order appeared routine, but the attached instructions revealed its real purpose: temporary audit logs connected to Isaiah Freeman's check would be deleted and replaced with a reconstructed record approved by senior management. Maya still possessed limited access to an offline compliance archive that had not yet been disconnected. Darius King used his valid security credentials to escort her into the bank's secondary data center, not to steal confidential material but to preserve evidence the bank was legally required to protect. Inside the cold, windowless storage room, they found the timeline Nathaniel Crowe had tried to bury. Isaiah's check had been confirmed as genuine at 9:41 a.m. Grant Whitlock opened the confirmation at 9:44. 3 minutes later, Nathaniel issued a manual freeze order against the Freeman Ridge account. The fraud file had been created before Isaiah entered the building. Lobby cameras were switched to non-recording mode exactly 3 minutes before Grant tore the check, and Grant's account later transmitted an image of the missing verification strip to an external server. Every action had been timed. The humiliation in the lobby had not been an impulsive act of prejudice. It had been one stage of a coordinated operation. While Maya and Darius raced to preserve the records, Aravex recovery vehicles arrived at the Freeman Ridge grain warehouse and 3 neighboring farms. Adrian Vale claimed the cooperative had violated its loan agreements and ordered his crews to seize tractors, irrigation equipment, and harvested crops waiting for delivery. Isaiah gathered the farmers at the main gate, but he gave them one firm instruction: no weapons, no threats, and no physical retaliation. Adrian had brought camera operators who filmed every angry face and raised voice, waiting for one person to lose control so Teravex could portray the farmers as a violent mob. When a truck driver attempted to enter through a side gate, Isaiah stepped directly in front of the vehicle. The truck continued moving at a slow, deliberate pace, forcing him backward one step at a time. Simone rushed between them and held up the seizure notice. The parcel number listed on the document belonged to an abandoned property 12 miles away. Teravex had no legal authority to enter the Freeman Ridge warehouse. Adrian barely looked at the mistake. By morning, the paperwork will match the property, he said, revealing that he expected the documents to be altered after the seizure had already taken place. Inside the data center, Maya found a hidden directory labeled Project Red Acre. It contained 87 farms marked for financial pressure, foreclosure, or acquisition. Each family had been assigned categories such as low resistance probability, limited access to legal counsel, and minimal media exposure. Most of the owners were Black or Latino. The system never listed race directly. Instead, it used postal codes, surnames, church locations, public assistance history, and neighborhood demographics to produce discriminatory results, while allowing Aldercrest to deny that race had ever been considered. The cruelty had been translated into data fields, risk scores, and professional language. Families were not being selected because they had failed. They were being selected because the bank believed they would be too isolated, too poor, or too frightened to fight back. Maya encrypted the entire directory and sent it to Simone. The transmission reached 98% when the power suddenly died. Emergency lights flashed red. The security doors locked automatically, trapping Maya and Darius inside. Seconds later, the fire suppression system activated even though there was no smoke or flame. Chemical mist poured from the ceiling, coating the servers and threatening to destroy the remaining hardware. Darius forced his jacket over Maya's face and dragged her away from the equipment as alarms began screaming through the room. At Freeman Ridge, Simone's phone received the damaged but readable file. Buried inside it was an email from Nathaniel Crowe. Once Freeman is removed from representative authority, Red Acre may proceed to harvest phase. Attached was a list of Teravex beneficiaries. The first name belonged to the Crowe Heritage Family Trust. Nathaniel was not merely protecting Teravex. His family was profiting from every farm Aldercrest forced into collapse. But the evidence alone would not stop the auction. Unless Isaiah obtained an emergency court order by morning, all 87 farms could be sold before the public learned why they had been targeted. At 7 o'clock the next morning, the federal courthouse in Jackson was already filled with farmers, reporters, bank attorneys, and Teravex representatives watching an online auction countdown on their phones. While 23 family farms moved closer to being sold, Simone Freeman stood before the judge and demanded immediate relief. She asked the court to unfreeze every Freeman Ridge cooperative account, stop Teravex from selling the farms, force Aldercrest to preserve all electronic records, suspend the fraud investigation against Isaiah, and recognize the $2 million check according to the time it had originally been presented. Across the courtroom, Aldercrest's attorneys argued that the files Maya Reynolds had recovered were stolen, incomplete, and potentially manipulated. Nathaniel Crowe testified that he knew nothing about Isaiah's transaction, until he entered the branch and saw the confrontation. Grant Whitlock then swore that he had honestly believed the check was counterfeit. He claimed Isaiah had threatened the staff, pressured Maya to ignore security procedures, and moved toward him aggressively before police arrived. The courtroom doors opened before Grant finished speaking. Maya entered wearing clothes still damp from the bank's fire suppression chemicals. Darius King followed her, carrying the security recording device in a sealed evidence bag. Maya testified that the system displayed validated no-fraud indicators before Grant tore the check, and that Grant personally viewed the result. Darius played the audio in which Grant said Isaiah only needed to be detained until the paperwork was stamped, followed by an unidentified voice ordering him not to let Isaiah leave with the original check intact. The bank's attorneys immediately challenged the recordings, arguing that Darius could not prove the complete chain of custody and that Maya had accessed files after her authority was suspended. For several tense minutes, the judge appeared ready to deny the emergency request because the technical evidence had not yet been independently verified. On the courtroom monitor, the auction clock continued, counting down. Simone then called a representative from the bank that had issued the cashier's check. Appearing by secure video, the representative confirmed that Aldercrest had requested verification that morning and received a clear response. The check was genuine, fully funded, and free of fraud alerts. The confirmation had arrived at exactly 9:41 a.m. Grant had torn the check at 1019. He had known the truth for 38 minutes. The judge's expression hardened. She ordered the auction suspended for 72 hours, froze all transfers to Terravex, and directed Aldercrest to preserve every record connected to the transaction. Several farmers began crying in the gallery. Isaiah closed his eyes briefly, believing the court had finally given them enough time to fight. Then Adrian Vale rose from the Terravex table, with a document in his hand. He announced that Isaiah no longer possessed legal authority to represent the Freeman Ridgeland Trust. According to a resolution signed the previous evening, Isaiah had been removed as the trust's authorized representative. Without that authority, he had no legal right to deposit the $2 million check, activate the $240 million conservation fund, or ask the court to protect the farms on the trust's behalf. The document carried the signature of Evelyn Price, the trust's co-founder and Isaiah's closest friend for more than 40 years. The courtroom doors opened again. Evelyn entered slowly, avoiding Isaiah's eyes. When the judge asked whether the signature was hers, she answered yes. Simone stared at her in disbelief. "You betrayed every family in this room." Isaiah raised one hand, stopping her. He studied Evelyn's lowered face and trembling fingers. He did not accuse her or demand an explanation. He asked only, "What did they use to make you do this?" Evelyn said nothing. The judge allowed the 72-hour suspension to remain in effect, but warned Simone that she now had to prove the removal was fraudulent or obtained through coercion. Otherwise, Isaiah's case could collapse before the auction resumed. Outside the courtroom, Evelyn passed Isaiah without looking at him. As their hands briefly touched, she pressed a folded note into his palm. It read, "They control my son's medical loan. Nathaniel said the bank would demand full payment if I refused to sign." Below the message was the address of a Terravex warehouse. Isaiah now had less than 72 hours to prove Evelyn had been coerced, but the warehouse she had identified did not contain the records of only one frightened family. It held the stolen history of an entire community. Isaiah Niane. He knew that one unauthorized step onto the property would give Nathaniel Crow exactly what he wanted. Another excuse to portray him as reckless, dangerous, and willing to ignore the law. Instead, Simone used the address Evelyn had provided to request an emergency preservation order, arguing that the warehouse might contain evidence connected to an active fraud investigation. While the court reviewed the application, Lena Morales published the first major report on Project Red Acre. She included the discriminatory risk categories. Maya had recovered the suspicious timing of Isaiah's fraud file and the connection between Aldercrest's delayed transactions and Terravex's land acquisitions. Within hours, farmers from several counties began arriving at the Baptist Church in Claiborne County. Some carried loan files in cardboard boxes. Others brought foreclosure notices, rejected refinancing applications, or photographs of land their families no longer owned. Their names were different, but their stories sounded almost identical. One farmer said Aldercrest had lost his planting loan 3 days before seed purchases were due. Another said her funds were delayed until drought destroyed the crop she could no longer irrigate. A third had never missed a payment, Yet his interest rate increased without explanation, and his refinancing request was denied the same week. Teravex offered to buy his property for less than half its value. Those who rejected the offers were suddenly labeled high-risk customers, investigated for fraud, or threatened with immediate foreclosure. In almost every case, Teravex appeared within days of Alder Crest, creating the financial crisis. Isaiah listened from the front pew, his face growing heavier with every testimony. What had happened to him was not the first attack. It was simply the first time the bank had made the mistake of targeting someone with enough legal support, community trust, and documentary evidence to fight back. Evelyn Price then stood before the church and confessed what had happened. Nathaniel had threatened to demand immediate repayment of her son's medical loan unless she signed the document removing Isaiah from the land trust. Adrian Vale had prepared the resolution in advance and given her 10 minutes to sign. She had not been allowed to call a lawyer. Adrian also told her that Isaiah had secretly agreed to sacrifice her family's farm in order to save the others. Evelyn admitted that fear had overcome her judgment. Her testimony damaged Teravex's claim that Isaiah had been removed voluntarily, but Simone still needed physical evidence, proving the coercion was part of a larger operation. The court finally approved the preservation order. Investigators entered the Teravex warehouse and discovered far more than loan files. Corporate records revealed that Teravex was controlled through a chain of shell companies, private partnerships, and anonymous holding firms. At the end of that chain stood the Crow Heritage Family Trust. Nathaniel's family was the ultimate beneficiary. Aldercrest created defaults through delayed funding, manufactured penalties, and denied refinancing. Teravex then purchased the distressed land at a fraction of its value. Nathaniel profited when the farms failed, and again when they were sold. As soon as the ownership records became public, Nathaniel attempted to isolate the scandal. He announced that Grant Whitlock had acted alone, violated bank policy, and been terminated immediately. But before investigators could question him, Grant disappeared. His car was found abandoned near the interstate, his phone smashed on the pavement, and his employee history deleted from Aldercrest's personnel system. Some believed Nathaniel had silenced him. Simone suspected Grant had fled because he knew he was being prepared as the only person who would take the blame. Late that night, Isaiah received a voicemail from a public telephone. Grant's voice was low and shaking. Crow ordered the delay, but he wasn't the one who told me to tear the check. That order came from someone on the board. If you want to know who truly approved Red Acre, protect me before they find me. Nathaniel had profited from the conspiracy, but he had not built it alone. The next confrontation would take place inside the boardroom, where discrimination had been transformed from personal prejudice into official corporate policy. The public hearing before the State Banking Commission began under television lights, with reporters packed along the walls and dozens of farmers seated behind Isaiah Freeman. In a private room only a few yards away, Aldercrest's board of directors was holding an emergency meeting trying to decide which executives could be sacrificed without bringing down the entire institution. Nathaniel Crow entered the hearing composed and carefully rehearsed. He claimed Grant Whitlock had acted without authorization when he tore Isaiah's check. He described Project Red Acre as an ordinary debt management program intended to identify financially vulnerable agricultural accounts. Teravex, he insisted, was an independent company with no influence over lending decisions. The disproportionate number of Black and Latino farmers harmed by the program was, in his words, an unfortunate statistical coincidence. He then accused Isaiah of exploiting a simple customer service dispute to damage the bank and force approval of a risky $240 million fund. Aldercrest's attorney continued the attack by questioning Isaiah's age, education, familiarity with modern banking systems, and ability to understand a transaction involving $2 million. The implication was clear. A 70-year-old Black farmer could not possibly understand the financial instrument he had carried into the bank. Isaiah did not raise his voice. He placed the 2 torn pieces of the check on the table and looked directly at the commissioners. "I understand enough to know a bank is required to verify an instrument before destroying it," he said, "and I understand enough to know you verified this one before you tore it." The rear doors opened before the attorney could respond. Grant entered with a private lawyer and 2 federal agents. The room erupted in whispers as he requested permission to testify in exchange for protective consideration. Grant admitted that he had known the check was genuine. He confessed that he had removed the strip containing the verification digits, sent an image of it to a server, identified by Aldercrest's legal department, and used those numbers to manufacture the duplicate deposit alert. He had also provided false information to police describing Isaiah as dangerous and connected to organized fraud. Grant said he had been promised a promotion and a substantial bonus if he delayed the deposit past the land trust deadline. If Isaiah refused to leave quietly, Grant had been instructed to create what internal messages called a public credibility event, a confrontation dramatic enough to make the farmer appear threatening on camera. Grant did not ask to be seen as innocent. He admitted he accepted the money because he believed the bank would protect him and because he assumed no one would believe an older black farmer dressed in work clothes over a respected bank manager. "I thought his appearance had already convicted him," Grant said. "All I had to do was give people a story they were prepared to accept." The evidence came forward in rapid succession. Maya Reynolds produced emails showing that a board subcommittee had approved Red Acre's targeting criteria and reviewed monthly reports on forced defaults. Darius King submitted an offline security recording showing Grant receiving direct instructions from Nathaniel shortly before Isaiah entered the branch. Lena Morales presented the files of 87 farmers whose loans had been delayed, altered, or denied shortly before Terravex attempted to acquire their land. Evelyn Price testified that Aldercrest had used her son's medical debt to force her into removing Isaiah from the trust. Simone then displayed payment records showing that after nearly every Terravex acquisition, a strategic consulting fee was transferred to the Crow Heritage Family Trust. Nathaniel attempted to interrupt, but the commission ordered him to remain seated. Minutes later, regulators froze every Terravex-related transaction. Federal investigators entered the hearing room, took Nathaniel's phone and laptop, and served Adrian Vale with a seizure order for his legal files. Then Grant revealed the conspiracy had begun long before Isaiah walked into Aldercrest. Inside a restricted records cabinet, the bank maintained files on 16 other financial instruments, cashier's checks, approved loans, refinancing letters, and payment guarantees that had been lost, destroyed, or delayed on the exact dates. Farmers needed them to prevent foreclosure. One of the records carried the name of Maya's late father. Maya stared at the document as Grant explained that her father's refinancing approval had been received on time but deliberately removed from his file. For 20 years, her family had believed they lost their farm because he had failed to manage it properly. Aldercrest had allowed that shame to follow him to his grave while secretly selling the land to Terravex. The investigation was no longer professional for Maya. It had uncovered the lie that had shaped her entire family. The system was finally exposed, but Isaiah now faced another choice: accept millions in private compensation and end the scandal, or force Aldercrest to return what it had taken from every family it had targeted. Nathaniel Crow was suspended within hours of the hearing, while federal investigators opened cases involving bank fraud, conspiracy, and unlawful financial gain. Adrian Vale was arrested for suspected document forgery and obstruction of justice. Grant Whitlock was formally charged as well, though prosecutors agreed to consider a reduced sentence because he had begun cooperating. Aldercrest Bank and Trust now faced the possibility of losing its license, defending dozens of lawsuits, and surviving a wave of customers withdrawing their money. Desperate to stop the collapse, the board summoned Isaiah Freeman and Simone to an emergency meeting. Their attorneys placed a $12 million settlement on the table. The bank would compensate Isaiah for the public humiliation, erase every debt attached to Freeman Ridge Farm issue, a replacement $2 million check, restore his reputation through a public statement, and appoint him to an honorary advisory position. In return, the class action case would be settled privately. The affected farmers would surrender their right to pursue separate claims, and Aldercrest would never be required to admit that Project Red Acre had discriminated against Black and Latino landowners. For the first time, Simone hesitated. $12 million could fund lawyers, save struggling families, and build a powerful community organization. She quietly told Isaiah that they could take the money and use it against the very system that had tried to destroy them. Isaiah understood her reasoning, but he also understood what the bank was truly buying. "They are not paying us to fix the damage," he said. "They are paying us to let them say the damage never happened." He rejected the offer and presented his own conditions. Aldercrest would return land taken through forged or deliberately mishandled documents. Every penalty and inflated interest charge created by Project Red Acre would be canceled. A public compensation fund would be established for all victims. Every agricultural foreclosure, from the previous 15 years, would be independently reviewed. Maya Darius. And every employee who reported wrongdoing would receive permanent legal protection. The bank would publish the names of all executives and directors who approved Red Acre. It would also be forbidden from selling agricultural debt to companies with overlapping ownership, and its lending data would be placed under outside supervision. The board accused Isaiah of trying to punish the entire institution for the crimes of a few people. Isaiah answered that he was not asking for punishment, he was asking for restoration. Later, Grant requested a private conversation. His face had lost the arrogance it carried in the lobby. He asked Isaiah to tell prosecutors that he had only followed Nathaniel's instructions. Isaiah looked at him without anger. "Crow did not force you to look at my clothes and decide I was a criminal," he said. "That part was your choice." Isaiah did not demand that Grant receive the harshest possible sentence, but he refused to erase his responsibility simply because someone more powerful had given the order. The first legal victories arrived that afternoon. The court ruled that Evelyn Price had signed the removal document under coercion and restored Isaiah's authority over the Freeman Ridge Land Trust. The issuing bank replaced the $2 million check and recognized its effective date as the morning Isaiah originally presented it. The $240 million conservation fund was activated, stopping the sale of 23 farms. At Freeman Ridge, families cried, embraced, and watched the auction notices disappear from the system. For a brief moment, it seemed the crisis had finally ended. Then Simone discovered one remaining transfer. Ruth Coleman, a widow whose family had worked the same property for 3 generations, had lost her farm minutes before the regulatory freeze took effect. Terravex had transferred the land to a newly formed company, which planned to demolish the barn and clear the fields at sunrise. Isaiah studied the sale documents and noticed the name of the notary who had certified the transfer. Simone searched the public records twice before confirming the impossible truth: the notary had been dead for 3 years. Terravex had not merely manipulated loans or abused banking procedures. It had forged ownership itself. Isaiah closed the file and stood. Saving 23 farms meant nothing if one family was still abandoned to a fraudulent document. Before dawn, he and Simone would have to stop the first bulldozer from entering the Coleman property. Before sunrise, the first bulldozer reached the Coleman farm. Its headlights cut through the morning fog as demolition crews gathered beside the locked gate carrying documents that declared the property legally transferred to a private development company. Ruth Coleman stood on the porch of the farmhouse her family had owned for 3 generations, clutching the original deed against her chest. The company's representative refused to delay the demolition. He insisted the sale had been completed before the federal freeze, and warned that anyone blocking the equipment would be arrested for trespassing. Isaiah Freeman arrived with Simone and dozens of farmers from the cooperative. They formed a quiet line across the entrance, leaving their tools, trucks, and anger behind. Isaiah ordered everyone to keep their hands visible and avoid touching the machinery. He knew Adrian Vale's allies wanted a confrontation. One shove, one broken window, or one raised fist would allow them to turn the victims into a violent mob and hide the forged transfer behind another public scandal. Simone submitted an emergency petition through the federal court's electronic system, but the judge demanded immediate proof that the ownership documents were fraudulent. With the courthouse not yet open, every minute mattered. Maya Reynolds searched the recovered Project Red Acre archive and found a digital copy of the notarization record. The seal used on Ruth's transfer had been entered into Aldercrest's system 18 months after the notary's death. Darius King then located offline security footage showing Adrian carrying unsigned property documents into the bank's restricted processing room. He left less than 20 minutes later with the same pages fully executed and stamped. Simone transmitted both files to the judge as the bulldozer's engine grew louder. The driver lowered the blade and began moving toward the gate. Isaiah did not step aside. Ruth stood beside him, trembling but refusing to leave her land. With only yards remaining, a message appeared on Simone's phone: emergency title freeze granted. All demolition and transfer activity suspended, pending a criminal investigation. The sheriff ordered the driver to shut down the machine and instructed the development crew to leave. Ruth's knees weakened as the bulldozer reversed. Her family had survived the final attempt to erase them from their own land. 6 months later, the conspiracy that began with one torn check had reshaped Aldercrest Bank and Trust. Nathaniel Crowe was indicted on charges including bank fraud, conspiracy to obtain property through coercion, obstruction of justice, and concealment of financial interests. Adrian faced prosecution for document forgery, witness intimidation, and unlawful property transfers. Grant Whitlock pleaded guilty to destroying a financial instrument, providing false information to law enforcement, and participating in the manufactured fraud case against Isaiah. His cooperation reduced his sentence, but it did not remove his responsibility. Aldercrest was forced to rebuild its agricultural lending system under independent supervision. Surveillance records were moved to external storage that bank executives could not alter. Every rejected transaction required a written explanation. Postal codes, neighborhood data, surnames, church locations, and other demographic substitutes could no longer be used to reproduce racial discrimination through hidden algorithms. Delayed agricultural loans triggered automatic outside reviews. Employees were given direct reporting access to regulators, and a new oversight council included farmers, legal experts, and community representatives. 15 years of foreclosures were reopened. Families whose land had been taken through forged or manipulated records received their property back or compensation based on its current value. Bank executives were permanently prohibited from holding financial interests in companies that purchased distressed debt. Maya joined the Independent Ethics Office not as a reward but to reopen her father's case and the cases of other families who had carried undeserved shame for decades. Darius became head of evidence preservation. Lena Morales expanded her investigation into similar land acquisition schemes in other states. Isaiah refused the honorary seat Aldercrest offered him. Instead, he founded the Freeman Agricultural Justice Center, which provided free contract reviews, financial education, and legal assistance to small farmers before a bank or corporation could exploit their isolation. The two torn halves of the original check were placed inside a glass frame at the center, not in the bank. One afternoon, a teenage volunteer asked Isaiah why he had preserved a piece of paper that no longer had financial value. Isaiah looked through the window at the fields glowing beneath the harvest sun. "That check could be issued again," he said. "Land can be won back. But when a man allows someone else to decide his worth by the clothes he wears, what he loses is harder to recover than money." The boy studied the torn paper and asked whether Grant had taken Isaiah's dignity when he ripped it apart. Isaiah smiled. No, he only tore a piece of paper and allowed the world to see who he really was. Then Isaiah returned to the fields beside the families who had once stood hours away from losing everything. He was not remembered as the man who carried a $2 million check. He was remembered as the farmer who transformed one public humiliation into the evidence that forced an entire system to change. Isaiah Freeman walked into that bank carrying a $2 million check, but what he defended was worth far more than money. By refusing a private payoff, he exposed a system that had stolen land, dignity, and hope from entire farming communities. Grant tore the paper. Nathaniel tried to bury the truth, but neither could destroy the evidence or silence the people who finally stood together. In the end, justice was not measured by how much Isaiah received, but by how much was returned to those who had been wronged. What would you have done if you were standing in Isaiah's place? If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories where truth defeats corruption.